I'm here with Shirley Basket, and I am excited for you to share your story. We're on a bit of a time delay because I'm in the US and you're in Australia, so I'm up early and you're up late. Thank you
That's
for
right.
joining me. And if you could just get started with your story, it's very similar, I think, to my story and to a lot of other people's stories. The difference is the time that we grew up. We grew up in a time where we were not affirmed,
Yeah.
we were not told we were born in the wrong body, and we were not encouraged to embrace a trans identity. So why don't you go ahead and just tell us about your story?
Well, I guess I never really lived with a trans identity as such, but I certainly lived with a lesbian identity for nearly 9 years, right through my 20s, basically. I was actually born in New Zealand, but I now live in Australia. But I think that if I had been young today, I would certainly have been identified around about the age of 10, and people probably would have talked me into or helped me, if they might have put it that way, to transition. Because back at that time, all I ever dreamt about was being a boy. And there were reasons for that, because I'd grown up in a family where I had an older brother who was autistic. Well, I guess that was it. They didn't have a name for it back then. There were a lot of things they didn't have identities and labels for back then. But he required 24/7 care by my parents, by my mother. And so as I was growing up, when I was born anyway, I guess that I didn't really get that kind of bonding that I needed with my mother. And you unpack these things as you become an adult and look back and see what really happened. But by the time I was 4, he had run away from home at one stage, and they found him not a year later, they found him about a week later, and he had drowned in one of the harbours in Auckland, in the city I grew up in. And so that was very traumatic for my parents. And so my mother then went into grief, which she never really came out of, and probably triggered some sort of perhaps mental illness. And so as I was growing up, my mother was not the kind of person I wanted to be. And she was crying most of my life. And so I kind of thought, if that's what it is to be female, I don't want to be that. And at the same time, because of all this distance, because of the trauma in my childlike mind, I thought if I'd been born a boy, then I might have got the love and attention that I was yearning for. On top of that, my mother also had very dim feelings about men. And so most of my life she would say to me, it's a man's world, you'd be better off if you were born a boy, and all this sort of thing. And not that she wanted me to be a boy, she really wanted me to be a girl. In fact, that became a thing of conflict as I got into my teens. You know, why aren't you more like a girl and stop sitting like that and be more feminine? And but she kept giving these messages that it was a man's world and I would have been better off being a male. And I used to think, well, I wish I had been. And so, so I had this kind of, I wish that I'd been a boy. When I got into my teens, I loved dressing up, and in my 20s. And so I did often like to kind of do fancy dress and dress as a guy if I could get away with it, going to a party or something like that. I did go into a lesbian identity, and because I discovered that I had same-sex attraction, and a couple of my friends actually did transition as much as they could do in that time. And I envied them, but at the same time, I'd hidden that I was lesbian to my parents because I often used to say I was more afraid of my mother than I was of God. And so I'd hidden my life that I was living, but it would have been much harder to hide transitioning and growing a beard and knocking on the door at home and trying to hide that. So I didn't go down that track, but I certainly thought about it. Of course, I would have had a lot more allies,
Yeah, and I think what's important for people to realize is that in your case, you had exactly what they define as a trans identity, which is insistent, persistent, and consistent, which is how they define it. So based on their definition of transgender, you actually were transgender, even though you didn't have that label.
Well, I certainly would have been discerned as that as now.
Right.
And in fact, I can remember in when I got into puberty, And I had an older sister. She was 5 years older than me. And at that stage, she was sort of just about to start going to work and that sort of thing. But I was growing breasts. And unlike her, she was kind of very small, but I got very buxom. And I hated it. I didn't want to buy bras, and I used to cry and cry. Nowadays, of course, I would have been delighted to have chest binding and whatever else, but the only thing that really got me through that phase was that my sister promised me that once she started work, she would save up enough so that I could have my breasts reduced anyway or taken off, you know. So that kind of got me through puberty. But then after that, and I think this is probably what will happen, it was tormenting for me, as they do say. It can be very tormenting, but I am so thankful that I didn't live in this era where I would have been pushed through, because by the time I got into my 20s, you know, I was okay with being female, although, of course, as I say, I did become lesbian. And that's sort of how it outworked me. And I mean, I didn't go into the kind of, people always have all these kind of assumptions that lesbians are either butch or femme or whatever else. Actually, I don't know that I could have really put myself as either of those things. Sometimes I might have seen myself in the more kind of butch persona. Other times I saw myself as more feminine. So I had to wear dresses to work and that sort of thing. I was working in the travel industry, so you know, so I was kind of okay with both, but I was very, very proud of my lesbian identity, and that was for sure.
And I think that one of the reasons that women like you and I are so concerned about what's happening is that we had this trajectory that a lot of the girls on today, and instead of being affirmed and told that we were in fact born in the wrong body, we didn't get those messages. We weren't affirmed. We weren't told that we were inherently flawed and that we were born in the wrong body. In my case, I got some therapy to help me feel more comfortable with being a woman and accept that I was a woman. In your case, it sounds like you just sort of managed it until you outgrew it. But now we're seeing legislation where therapists are mandated to affirm kids who feel like we did and tell them that they are in fact boys and not girls, and encouraging them to transition. And so
Yeah,
you tell me about what's happening in Australia, because that's how we connected, is that we both are fighting against these the new legislation that's mandating therapists to affirm kids like we were. And can you imagine, I
yeah,
mean, I don't know if you think about this, but I think, oh my gosh, can I, you know, what would have happened to my life if I had been told I was born in the wrong body, if I'd been encouraged to go on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones? I might not even be around today because of how harmful those
yeah,
are. But certainly my life would not have been as
yeah,
fulfilling and filled with joy and opportunity. I would have had lifelong medical problems. And ultimately, I never would have gotten the help I needed to identifying those underlying feelings that cause the trans identity. And in your case, those feelings that you had of abandonment, of not feeling like your mother loved you, I mean, those are all very important feelings to process. And you don't get to
mm,
process them if you're told you're transgender.
yeah, yeah, that's right. And I'm afraid back in my time, there wasn't really any help of any kind. So there wasn't really help to work through those issues about your femininity or anything like that. But I can tell you, I am so thankful that I wasn't living in the time that it is now, because like you, I think that if I had gone through and done what I wanted to do and try to um, be male or whatever else, that would never have really worked anyway. You know, and I often say now that part of me was that I thought that maybe God had made a mistake and put a man into a rather short female body, you know, and that he'd maybe made a mistake. But later on in my faith, I found that I found myself being assured that that's not what happened, that it wasn't a mistake at all. And so then later on, I thought about it, and I thought one of the reasons why I thought that perhaps maybe I was male in a female body was that I thought that my brain was more male, and that I thought more like a male. Now, I was definitely not sporty. A lot of the girls can be very sporty. I was definitely not that. but I loved maths, physics, and politics, and that kind of thing. So my pursuits or values or whatever were completely different from my friends. But I was also analytical, and the way that I analysed, I would kind of like be working through things. My mind would be working things over. And when you think about it, and in fact, I used to be, a lot of people say, you know, that the women like this sometimes don't have friends in school. Well, some of us did. Some of us had a lot of friends in school because, like me, I thought that I was a great protector. You know, this sort of, you know, I was the female that was your male protector, if you like. And that was kind of the underlying feeling that I had. So I always had a lot of friends because I was very nurturing and protective. But when I thought about that afterwards, I thought my brain was analysing the way that females do it, was zapping backwards and forwards. And it was mostly about nurture and about loving and that sort of thing, which was actually very female. So it was a lie for me to believe that my brain was male in any real way at all. It was just different. And there's a small percentage of women who are different, and that's okay. It doesn't make them any less female or any less feminine. In fact, probably even more feminine in many ways. And so, you know, because often the girls that I knew anyway, who they maybe had an external kind of butch type way of, you know, wanting to be seen or perceived, they were often the biggest, softest softies of all of my friends. In fact, we were probably more scared of the real girly girls because they could be sometimes quite mean. And they were the ones who probably today would be more likely to bully you on the phone or, you know, online or whatever else. So anyway, so I just now look back and think, well, actually, I was born and created and grew up as a different kind of female, and that's good. That's
We need
okay.
those role
And
models.
that's
We need
great.
examples of how women can be, you know, something different. And I think that, you
Yeah.
know, when I hear you talking about the way the way your brain works, it sounds so much like I remember thinking that, you know, even now, I have a sense that you know, when I hang out with the girls, I have a sense that, you know, the way my brain is processing things is very different than most women. But that doesn't mean I'm not a
Yeah.
woman. It means that I'm a woman
No,
whose brain
that's right.
it thinks a little bit differently, and that's okay. But now we
Yeah.
have this narrative that says if you think a little bit differently, it means you're actually a man. And I just think that's so sad.
Yeah. I think it's very sad. I think it's very sad. And if you couple that with same-sex attraction, of course, that can often endorse that a lot. You know, so
Because in my
just
mind, my
glad that
girlfriends
I
were
was
my
able to walk
girlfriends.
away from that.
Yeah, and I was a boy, so of course I was going to have girlfriends. It never even occurred to me to have a boyfriend until after I went through puberty. You know, but when I was a little kid, I actively cultivated girlfriends because in my mind I was a boy. And so,
Yeah.
you know, I would never have thought of myself as a lesbian, and it wasn't until I actually
No.
started talking about this that I was like, "Oh, I guess I did have relationships with girls," but at the time it didn't strike me as me being a lesbian. It struck me as me being a man having
Yeah.
having, you know, a heterosexual. So it gets very convoluted. But I would be really curious to hear about what you're doing in Australia, because Australia has been at the forefront of instituting some legislation that is incredibly scary.
And sadly, people are not informed. Well, they are informed. They're informed by the media. So they really only get a one-sided, slanted view of what truth actually is on these things. And that's very sad. And the trouble is, it's very difficult to get any other kind of information out because it has a strong hold on where everybody is being told they must believe, and so they won't use or print or have other things that actually bring another side into it. And so that's the first thing that's a big problem. But also, sadly, I mean, it's often Christians that are targeted because it will be Christian churches often that are the ones that say, well, hang on a minute, we believe that God created a male and a female. And so, of course, that then becomes hate speech, and then the idea is to try and silence and shut down churches. However, what's sad about that is that probably the majority of people in churches are unaware of that. And so, you know, they are also often uninformed. And often what I say is that people and leaders in churches often don't know what they don't know. And so, you know, I really think that we need to get a lot more information out that is factual and truthful, and science as well, because science is not on the side of the transgender push, that's for sure. But at the same time, there's also this push to try and stop any help at all for anybody who wants to walk away from a gay or a lesbian life either. And so
Right.
that, of course, is a much bigger thing to me, because I walked away from my life and there I know hundreds of people who have. And in fact, I even set up a website called Two Prisms, and I don't know if you want to put that somewhere on there,
Yeah, I'll put a link.
but I've got 151 people on there who say that I was either gay, lesbian, or transgender, and I am no longer. And so people can't say that we don't exist. We do exist. And people say, well, why is everybody so silent then if there are so many people out there who've left? But it's because the antagonism and the hostility that goes toward people who say they've walked out is so tough and so hard. People will lose jobs, all sorts of things. In fact, the whole pendulum has swung so much. When I was young, we were the pariahs, and I knew what it was to be villainized or whatever for being lesbian, because I was outwardly so. But now it's gone back the other way. And when I came out of my lesbian life and started saying to people that I had walked away, of course, I got all the usual people saying to me, well, you never were, or you're lying, or you're trying to suppress something. And so then I discovered that actually I never really knew what hate was. I became a once gay or once lesbian person. So this is why people don't speak up, because nobody really wants to have to go through those levels of intimidation, hatred, sometimes all sorts. And so what we've been trying to do here is get enough people, or as many people who will, to actually help put through some data. We've got a project going at the moment on a website called The Cause. It's called Freedom to Change. And so anybody who's happy to do that and fill out the survey, let them know the story, maybe even give a video of their story if they'd like to, just as a backup of the information. That's probably the biggest thing that we're doing at the moment. So people can be anonymous. They don't have to have their names on there. So it's mostly so that we can present something academic.
Right. And I just want to clarify for people who don't have the background, that what you're talking about is legislation in Australia that prohibits therapists from helping someone with either same-sex attraction or a trans identity identify underlying issues that might have influenced them into that identity, I guess is the way of saying it. In Utah, they are prohibited from dealing with thoughts, behaviors, and beliefs related to a trans identity. And one of the things that, you know, I have a friend here who was same-sex attracted and is now fighting against this legislation, because what he says is that he was an adult, he wanted to change, and now there's legislation that bans people who actually are actively trying to seek change from getting that help. And it's so important for people to understand that the fundamental role of therapy is to affect change. That's why people go to therapy, is they want to change something about themselves. And in this case, legislation is targeting a very specific type of behavior and saying, you can change anything else about yourself, but you're not allowed to change this. And for a lot of us, that's what's very concerning.
Well, I think the thing is, what it goes against is a human right, actually, because we should have the right to define and decide how we want to actually have our lives as adults. In Australia, I know in some parts of America they are trying to, or they have probably put through laws in some states, I think, where a minor cannot go and have help. In Australia, they're not even lining it up with minors, it's all people of all ages. And in fact, in the state that I live in Victoria, there is already a small clause in the health and safety laws to say that no professional can do what they call gay conversion therapy, which is defined even as a pastor who prays for somebody, a counselling group, a support group. But in particular at the moment, if somebody wanted to complain under the health and safety law about a professional, then it is illegal already in my state for any age. So there is no counsellor in my state who would do this. And so we don't have therapists that I'm aware of. I'm not even aware of any therapists in Australia at all. But the fear here is the fact that this is aiming at the church, and it's aiming at pastors who simply would say, okay, we'll help you, we'll walk with you. Whatever you decide you want to do with your faith in your life, we'll walk with you. But that person would be in danger of actually going to prison or being fined. That is actually draconian. It is Marxist. I mean, I hate to name it. Well, no, I don't hate to name it, because that's actually what it is. It's dictatorial.
It's really discriminating against just one group of people, and saying, you know, everybody else can have the right to change how they want to, but this one group can't. And, you know, for people who have insisted on tolerance and love and acceptance, what they're doing now is they are targeting a specific type of person and saying, you're not allowed to pursue the kind of change in your life that you want. And to me, this is really sad, because I've talked to Billy Burley and Walt Heyer, some of these other people who went through, you know, full sex change operations, thinking that it would make their lives better, and it didn't. And the way that they finally were able to find happiness was they went to a pastor, and they had, you know, a loving church community that embraced them as they were. And the more that they felt loved, the more they were able to kind of identify that what was really going on and resolve those feelings, and eventually learn to love themselves as they are. And in Australia, that's not legal now. And if people have their way here in the US, there are a lot of people who want to do this in the US. We have what's called the Equality Act. And if that gets passed, we're going to be in a very similar situation to Australia. And it's happening in other countries as well. And people don't realize, when they hear conversion therapy, they think that, you know, they're talking about electroshock therapy or a lobotomy or going into some kind of situation.
Shock treatment.
But in this case, even a pastor praying for someone is considered conversion therapy.
But nobody does those things.
Nobody, and that's the thing, nobody does those things. It's illegal to electrocute somebody. I mean, you just don't get to go do that. And a lot of, you know, these camps, even where, you know, some of these camps where they go, they call them Pray Away the Gay, those are still around in some places, but they're adults who decide to go to them. And what we're saying is that as an adult, you are not allowed to have this behavior. Well, at the same time, we're going to say, as an adult, you can take cross-sex hormones and amputate body parts. And so it's confounding to me why it is that we encourage people towards something that's very unhealthy and damaging to their body. And we're saying, if you want to go and try and change yourself in other ways, you can't go that route.
And so if somebody like me wanted to go for counselling to work back through the things that were traumatic in my childhood, for example, how my family handled grief and whatever else, if I wanted to do that and said that I was lesbian, that would not be allowable. I would not be allowed to get help. This is actually very, very harmful, very hurtful to people. Actually, when I was living my lesbian life, I was quite alcoholic as well, and because of that, I ended up having like anxiety and tremors and things like that. So I started going to a psychologist. And this is going back, wow, I won't say how many years, but a long time ago, decades ago. And I went to a secular psychologist, and she discovered that, first she discovered that I was lesbian, and then second she discovered that I had come from a Christian home. So from then on, she decided that my big problem was that I was a fish swimming against the water and that I needed to ditch my Christian background. Well, I had already done that, and I didn't feel like I was a fish swimming against the water. And so we went week after week after week of her trying to get my Christian upbringing out of me, which was pretty stupid at the time because I was nowhere near living that way. I was very proud of my lesbian identity and had no issues with that at that stage. But I was alcoholic. She never once asked me about my drinking. She was so set on trying to affirm me. And this is decades ago, Erin. So I can imagine now how difficult it would be to actually have somebody who was skillful, who actually did find your issues. And I think that that's really, really bad, and it's going to harm a lot of people. I tell you, I got almost suicidal in the end because I thought I was trapped. And so, there needs to be help for people like me. Not everybody does want to walk out, but some people do. And so I think it's gone far too far now, and I think that it's the pendulum, as I say, swung way too far. Actually, for Australia, you mentioned about how Australia's been a bit of a forerunner with some of these things. Again, that's in the state that I live in. There was a report that was done from a university here called the La Trobe Report, after the La Trobe University that did it. And they spent 2 years doing a report on gay conversion therapy. They, first of all, I'm an academic, by the way, and so I have researched in this area too on what people and what the church is actually doing and what it's not doing. But in this research, they advertised for their sample group amongst gay and lesbian groups, nowhere else, and they looked for people who'd had gay conversion therapy, and they came up with 15 people, and I think none of them we were aware of. We hadn't come across any of them. And they had some really terrible things happen to them. For example, one had been asked to listen to some tapes of somebody or watch some videos of somebody who'd come out of being gay. That was really about the extent of it. I think there was one person who had said that they had, or the two I think that said that they had some of these bad experiences. One was aversion therapy or something, but it was like 40 or 50 years ago. And so the others, they were things like, oh, we were asked as a young person to go to a support group. Oh, that's just so scary, isn't it? So the report itself was probably one of the worst pieces of academic research that I have ever read. And yet now it's touted across the world as being this fabulous piece of research. And at the time, I was involved with some of the Christian ministries that do help people who want to come out of same-sex attraction or whatever else. But they never once contacted any of us. They quoted the names of some of them, but they never contacted one person. So to me, that is actually a very deceitful piece of academia, to be honest. And yet it's coming up in political discussions. I've seen it appear in discussions in Canada. This is a terrible piece of research. If anybody follows that, it is really because they already start with a bias. So,
well, and it's interesting because
feeling.
in the U.S. we have very similar research going on. I'm an academician as well, and when I look at the research methodology is flawed. It's self-selected, self-reported. They ask very leading questions.
Incredibly
The
flawed.
research is so bad. And yet when people come out and
Yeah.
we actually are beginning to realize that sexuality is very fluid, identity is very fluid.
That's right.
We know
Yeah.
this is not, these things are
Yeah.
not innate. We're very flexible. I know identity is very fluid because 2-3 years ago I identified as a Democrat leftist liberal, and I no longer identify as that
right.
because I've had some new information, new experiences, and my identity is different now. So we know that
Yeah.
identities are flexible, and to suggest that people should have to feel locked into an identity that they're uncomfortable with. And that's the key, is that we're in no way, at least I'm not saying someone who, we should no longer allow people to be transgender. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that if we have someone who's trans, who's a child who has underlying issues and needs to get help, that child should get help. And if we have an adult who has issues around their sexuality that they want to change, they should be able to get help. Just as if, someone had a porn addiction. If someone had a porn addiction, they wanted to get help, they should be able to get help. If someone was overly promiscuous and they wanted to get help, they should be able to get help. So for some reason, we've identified just this one little area where we're not going to allow people to make a choice about how they want to live.
That's right. Yes, it's bullying, to be honest, and it has to stop. I feel like going back to activism and saying shame on you for not letting people have help. Why are you trying to stop people have self-respect and self-definition? So yeah, it's people have got to wake up, I think, and realize what's happening, because it's becoming dictatorial and it's becoming harmful. And so I'm going to use those kinds of words. It's hostility.
Right. And what's going to be so interesting is that if this is anything like any of the other videos I've made in which I talk about conversion therapy, YouTube will put a little link to Wikipedia's definition of conversion therapy underneath this video. Just because we're here talking about it, it will provide that link that will give people an inaccurate view of what conversion therapy is. So this is so invasive, so insidious that, just us talking about this, when I post it, YouTube somehow has an algorithm and they'll say, oh, they're talking about conversion therapy. We better put this inaccurate definition of conversion therapy under here because we don't want anybody to learn the truth, basically.
I mean, the crazy thing is nobody uses that term conversion therapy really anyway, other than activists. What on earth is conversion therapy? Conversion therapy is when people try and convert you to thinking that you must have to be trans or whatever else. That's a conversion therapy, when you're talking people into saying, well, you feel this way, so therefore you should go that way. That to me is conversion therapy, and that certainly should stop because that's harmful.
They're calling conversion therapy and banning something that in a lot of our minds is actually enabling really harmful conversion therapy. And that is taking a child who has some underlying issues and convincing them that they're born in the wrong body. I can't imagine anything more harmful than to tell a child that they were born in the wrong body, the self-hatred that they have for themselves is accurate, and that they should do everything they can to change how people perceive them in order to match these difficult feelings that they have. I mean, that's just bizarre. And when I think about this, when I think about, really, like you analyze it, it's just so convoluted that I can't even figure out how we got to this point.
Yeah, that's right. How did we get to this point? That is the amazing thing, because I just can't believe how fast people have adopted it. And I think part of it is people get afraid. They feel like they're going to be intimidated unless they kind of say that the king is wearing clothing. The old story where the king was not wearing clothing. But people are terrified of calling it out and saying, this is actually, we shouldn't go this way. Look, even a lot of my lesbian friends are annoyed about this at this stage because it's actually erasing lesbians, if you like, too. And it's saying that every woman who happens to have some of these feelings must be transgendered. And so, I think that can be really harmful as well.
It's also saying that lesbians should have sex with men who say that they're women. And so lesbians are under a lot of pressure right now because men who claim to believe they feel like they're women are saying, I'm a lesbian too. And even though I have a penis, it's actually a female penis. And if you don't have sex with me, you're being discriminatory. And so they're bullying lesbians in a way that is absurd and we shouldn't stand for.
That's right. And that actually is quite common. I mean, even again, back in my own old days when I was living lesbian, I did know transgendered men who believed they were lesbian. And that was actually fairly well known. That was a fairly common sort of thing, although at least back then nobody would have bullied you into saying that you had to accept that. But that's the thing. This whole issue is so complex. It is such a complex human thing that we can't just box it all in and say, well, therefore we'll label this person this way and they will always be that way. Because as you say, I mean, things are very flexible, and we do know now that not only identity but even sexual feelings can be very flexible. So, gender is not flexible. I think we need to be clear on that. But certainly sexual feelings and identities can be. They can change quite rapidly. In fact, some of the largest longitudinal studies have been done in New Zealand on sexual fluidity, and which is quite interesting, really. And what they have found is that people, as they get older, will actually move toward identifying, if they did identify as gay or lesbian, they will move toward identifying as heterosexual as they get older. And that's nothing to do with religion or anything else. It just happens to be something that does happen humanly. So, there've been a number of studies done this way. So I can't validate them on this short thing, but I've done written papers on them. So, it's quite well known. But except for the fact that it's not well known by the masses because they're not allowed to know. They get told what to believe. To be honest, I say to young people today, I would be really angry if I was young today because you've been lied to. You need to actually research. There's a lot of information on the net so far until it all gets taken off and banned. Please look at it now before it does, before all the book burning begins. It's already sort of started anyway, because you will only be allowed to believe in one way, and you will be believing things that are not true and lead a lot of people into a great deal of pain. So anyway, that's me.
Well,
But I'll tell you what, I'm glad that I was able to walk away.
yeah, and that's where I feel like just all these that, I can't imagine if somebody tried to pass legislation that required therapists to affirm a heterosexual identity and wouldn't allow a client to explore possibly changing a heterosexual identity. People would be up in arms. They would say, oh, no, you can't do that. That's
absolutely.
That's homophobic. We can't do that. And yet they've done it.
Yeah, that's right.
First. So as we're finishing up here, is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get a chance to talk about yet?
But if we can get enough data together, we want to be able to try and at least provide some evidence that is factual and, show that there is a second side to these things, that there is another way of seeing this, and that there is evidence that many people do change. And I'm sure you're well aware, especially for females, that it's been an exponential curve of young women going toward transgender and now wanting to transition. And so that is becoming dire because they're being told that you can reverse easily and you cannot, especially not for females. And so, this is producing a whole generation of some young women who are going to have their whole lives destroyed. But so I do hope that we can get some more information out there and at least slow this thing down. I can't believe how fast it's been going. And well, I do believe it in some ways because, as I say, it's the level of intimidation, it's the power of the loudest voices. But I think though most of us probably do feel a bit timid about speaking up, we can't afford to remain timid about it. We have to speak up. And those of us especially that have come from this, we need to say, yes, we were once lesbian or we were once transgender or gay, and we are no longer. And we're not saying everybody else has to do the same as us, but we exist, and please give us the right to. We should surely have the same human rights. And so right now at the moment, the United Nations is talking about these things and trying to ban gay conversion therapy right across the whole world. And I think this is deplorable and it is uninformed. And so, we need to, I think, be able to say, well, we're going to stand up, and even if we do get fired at, we need to say, stop this. this is lunacy. So anyway, that's my probably, I probably said that in 10 different ways, but I do want to say that I am very glad that I was able to find my way through and out of this, and that my life after the age of 30 anyway became a lot more, well, I wouldn't say placid, because I ended up sharing my story and getting incredibly attacked. But however, my life itself has come back to a far greater place of peace, of finding my own self, finding who I really am, and, just being able to live with the decisions that I've had, and, and finding a wonderful companion for life who does happen to be a man. And so, for these things, I'm very grateful. But I may not have lived a life like this. I probably would have drunk myself to death, to be honest. So, it was a destructive life I was living. And so if I hadn't been able to actually find people who would walk with me, and and where I could actually just walk out of this and look back on all of it and see where all these things began, and be able to find those places of wholeness for myself, I don't know where I would have been. Well, I do. I wouldn't have been talking to you tonight, I don't think.
Right.
But I have lived to quite a good old age.
Well, and I'm thankful that you're willing to stand up, because those of us who are speaking out, we do get attacked, we get threats. Just what's happening to J.K. Rowling right now is just shocking. But this is an indication of just how bullying this movement has gotten. This is no longer about tolerance or about love. This is about a certain group of people bullying other people and really infringing on their basic rights. And I'm really grateful that you're standing up, doing your part in Australia. There are people in Canada and the UK and here in the US. I mean, we're starting to stand up and fight against it, but we need more people. So if you're out there, I know one of the issues that I had, and it made me so angry, that this is something I never thought I would share publicly. This is something very private to me. It's not something I ever wanted to like show the world. Sort of, here I am, I'm exposing myself. And it makes me so angry that in order for me to have a voice in this, I had to expose myself. And I shouldn't have to do that. I shouldn't have to tell everybody about my history in order to show that there is a different, that what these people are saying isn't true. But that's where we are, is that we need people who are willing to take that risk and be vulnerable and share their experience, because otherwise the bullies are going to win.
Yeah, that's right. And the thing is, I'm not going to change my story, because that is my story. And so, we should have the right to actually have our own story.